We heard a lot about change last week at the Conservative Party conference. What does that clear change look like, Peter?
Well, today, actually, what we're seeing with Rachel Reeves, what she's going to announce, is that we're going to lay the foundations for economic growth through a generation. And that's really important because we have a government which is sticking plaster. It's lurching from side to side on all the challenges that it has caused our economy and our society. She will be showing ways that we are going to streamline the planning system so that we can make sure that all of those critical elements of our economy going forward into the future are lined up so we can fully exploit our potential as an economy, not just for the days ahead and the months into a new government, but for the years and perhaps even parliaments into the future.
You know what you're going to be asked, which is that actually most of what we've heard from the Labour Party, rightly or wrongly, is the status quo, sticking with tax and spending policies and strict fiscal restraint, that phrase, echoed by Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. How are you going to change a country when there's no money?
Well, Keir has been very open and explicit about the political and policy plan that he's had since he became leader.
I was going to say, what about all those policy plans before he was leader, all the things he promised to do, and then as soon as he became leader, he completely jettisoned. And we now know, right? Mick Wright was tweeting about this before, for a quote from Morgan McSweeney, I believe. And McSweeney had learnt after Kendall's defeat, he led Labour together a low-profile pressure group that polled the party membership and revealed it was not overrun by hardened Trotskyists. McSweeney told Starmer that Corbyn supporters were split between older ideologues and younger idealists who opposed Brexit. And this Trotskyist entryism was officially debunked by the actual internal political party, right? They did all of these polls and they found that they weren't just a bunch of Trotskyist entryists. It was just people who think that austerity is and then they deliberately ran a campaign that focused ruthlessly on convincing Corbynites to abandon Corbynism without quite realising it worked. Literally, it's a complicated way of saying that they lied.
By-elections of recent times, the stunning victories that we've had shows that the plan is working to date. What we're doing now is showing that with a year, possibly a year from an election, maybe 6 months, we are getting the foundations right that we can build on. We can do nothing without sensible economic policy that is delivering growth, and that growth is used to benefit all people across the whole economy and society and all regions of the United Kingdom. That's what Rachel's going to be showing today.
What's the real change going to have to look like?
Well, if a Labour government is going to have any money to pay for all of those different things, whether that's helping people with the cost of living crisis or whether it's improving the state of our hospitals, they're going to need to get some money from somewhere. As you say, Rachel Reeves has been very clear they're not looking to raise taxes on working people, and so the only way you're going to raise...
They're not looking to raise taxes on anybody. Like, who's getting their taxes raised? Some people are going to have to pay tax they won't otherwise be paying. Some people are going to have to pay tax on their private school fees. Some people are paying taxation in general because they're now no longer subject to the non-dom rule. But no one's having their taxes raised at all, whether they're a worker or whether they're an owner. Even if you didn't want to raise the overall tax burden, you want to keep the tax burden the same. If you truly believe in this message of having a government for working people, then surely you'd change taxation so you lower income tax, and then from there you'd also increase capital gains tax to offset it. The money coming into the exchequer would be the same, but the people who do the work, who create the value, who create the wealth of our civilization, get to keep more of theirs, and the people who make no wealth, who do no labour and just make money off other people's labour, pay more in taxation. You could do that. If you didn't want to run the risk of further increasing the current level of tax burden, you could quite easily keep the tax burden the same, but put more of that tax burden onto owners rather than workers, and they won't even do that. It'll be so easy to run on, right? Imagine if you ran on, we are going to reduce your taxes. Voters who matter, people in the red wall who still work normal jobs but own houses or whatever, we're reducing your taxes, whilst increasing taxes on random in the city of London who make money off of trading stocks and shares, or landlords, for example.
Taxes, raise money if it isn't raised taxes, is by creating growth in the economy in some way. But obviously, all politicians on all sides say they want to grow the economy. No one says they want the opposite. It's much more difficult to work out how do you do that, especially in the short term.
And that's again what's so frustrating. They say we'll grow the economy. First of all, how? And then second of all, how are you going to actually translate that into better living standards for everybody without some kind of redistribution or understanding where that growth is going to go?
If Labour win the next general election, it'll be the end of 13 years of Conservative government. And maybe that's just enough for voters.
All the polling shows, right, that voters want a change of sorts. And it becomes, who do you trust to deliver that? So Rachel's done this big interview with John today. You can trust me. What are we going to hear Rachel say in her speech? probably quite cautious, trying to keep the markets on side, not going to go and spend lots of money we
Unlike
don't
Liz
have.
Truss when she gave her speech, or quasi-Kwarteng.
But the question becomes, do you trust that Rachel won't be more radical, I suppose, in power, that she will be able to be the right person to kind of run the market?
Right, some people...
When you want her to be more radical in power, that's a good thing. She's not radical enough because, again, we're not actually getting any redistribution from her.
People, of course, would like her to be more radical.
Yeah.
What do you say in response to that?
Well, what I say is when you actually listen to what voters are telling us, and I'm out in mid-Bedfordshire all the time campaigning for our great candidate, Alistair Strafford.
Yes, well, let's not talk too much about the
Voters are telling us
by-election.
all the time that they've had enough of the boosterism, the completely outlandish promises which are never met. They've had it with Boris Johnson, they've had it with Liz Truss, they've seen what economic irresponsibility has done to our economy. So actually taking into account the constraints of working in a market economy is important. Rachel will act within that. But within those constraints, we will find opportunities. The tunnel under the Thames has taken years and years and years, and it's cost £800 million in red tape and paperwork before even a shovel has hit the ground. What we are doing is seizing the opportunity we have to prepare a credible programme for government, because we have the realistic opportunity of delivering it.
Okay.
I mean, like, tails are up here, right? You can tell they're sniffing power. It's just within their reach. Peter seems quite happy today. The question, I think, the more interesting question in a way for the Labour Party is, you're right, are they going to kind of resonate with the country this week? Are they going to connect with readers like mine? These are swing voters.
How are Sun readers swing voters? How are the kind of people who read The Sun ever going to vote Labour unless explicitly directed to by Murdoch on high?
They want to know what they're buying from you too. They want a bit of hope, a bit of optimism, sketching out your own offer to them. And I think that's what this week will be quite interesting in finding out.
We could be seeing Conservative seat numbers in like double figures. That's how much of a mauling that we're looking at getting in the next election, because people are really tactical voting pilled now as well. The tactical vote is going to be much higher now than it has been ever, because people are just desperate for the Tories out regardless of who it is. So if the Tories get beaten up in the southwest and across the north, and of course they will get routed in London, almost certainly the entirety of London Tories will get routed, we could be looking at double figures Conservative seats. So every seat is up for grabs. The tactical vote for the Green Party is one that you have to do when no party represents what you believe. It's exactly what UKIP voters did. All they believed in was Brexit. No party was giving it to them, so they voted UKIP to try and move the dial, and that's why I want to vote Green. I don't care about the Labour platform. It's not good enough for me. So I'm voting Green because I also believe that Labour basically nailed on to win the next election. So the important part is having the base of people who attack Labour from the left to ensure that the dial moves over the course of the next parliament. And of course, the more votes that the Greens get in a national landscape means that they have more impetus for positions on question time, on the official kind of debate stage. If they're polling at 10%, suddenly they're going to be in all the debates.
Everyone wants growth. Everyone talks about growth. Every Prime Minister talks about it.
It's a dumb position. Like, we want growth. Yeah, of course, everyone wants economic growth. In capitalism, it relies on growth continually. We have like a bunch of sovereign debt. It requires growth to pay down as long as that growth is higher than what we're paying on the yields on that debt. It's asinine to talk about wanting growth. What is important is to talk about how to get that growth. At the moment, we have deregulate some planning laws. That's it. That's the singular policy they have for growth, is just deregulate the planning sector.
How are you going to get it?
Yes, but you say 13 years, but there's one thing that's happened over the last 13 years. We've had a Conservative government,
right,
and which had growth of half of what we had before. So we know we can get it because the last Labour government delivered it consistently over 13 years.
They were completely different economic circumstances.
I'll answer the
when
questions
Labour
directly.
won in 1997, they inherited a much more favourable economic situation. You are going to inherit something completely different.
Which is why Rachel is spelling out getting the fundamentals right of our economy, laying the foundation. So earlier you said, is it exciting? You've just spelt out exactly why getting the foundations for a growing economy is right, getting the planning system right. You can't have a growing economy when 7.5 million people are waiting for treatment on the NHS.
And yet you don't have a real NHS plan outside of use the private sector, which, as we've already discussed 1,000 times, is not how it works, because they share a workforce, they share facilities, they actually share the infrastructure, right? You can't use the private sector to expand capacity. They rely on the same capacity. It's just where the money goes and where the money comes from. And the only other policy you have for the NHS is this workforce expansion plan, which is good. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be having a workforce expansion plan, but more private involvement and a workforce expansion plan does not fix the problems with the NHS. And just deregulating planning laws doesn't fix the problem with our housing system. These are just individual, tiny constituent parts of a gigantic pie of loads of problems with the level of growth in this country. And to rely on both of these as some kind of magical growth panacea, it's so patently nonsensical.
We understand that ending the waiting list targets for the NHS is part of economic growth and unleashing our potential. We understand that there are long-term investments we need to make. I will make a speech this afternoon. I will talk about 10-year funding for critical infrastructure in the life sciences sector and R&D.
It's going to be long-term. You mentioned the NHS and the strike that people are suffering, and perhaps some of them on the sort of protest lines themselves. What is it a Labour government is going to do? There is no talk of any extra money to end these strikes, so they'll continue under a Labour government.
The first thing we'll do is talk. I mean, the government haven't had talks with unions and staff working in the NHS for months. They've taken a polar opposite view. If you look at things like what the last Labour government did for delivering peace in Northern Ireland, we ended an armed civil conflict by getting it.
You didn't require money. There was no financial negotiation. You don't need money to do the Good Friday Agreement. What you needed was a bunch of different rules about how they were going to be able to mediate the border to ensure that there was a lasting peace. The doctors want money. They want money, and they're not going to leave until they get the money because the future of the NHS depends on it.
This lot can't get in the room and talk about pay and wages and terms and conditions without flouncing out and refusing to talk. You've got to get in the room, you've got to do a deal, and we've seen where deals have been made in the transport sectors, up in other parts of public services, where deals have been made. It's done by diligence, getting in the room and not leaving until a deal has been done.
It does
Unions have been flexible when they've been met with a flexible opponent.
Well, actually, that's interesting. Do you think, just by having a Labour government, that there is a political element to these strikes, that even if no more money is offered, that actually Labour will have more success at ending the strike?
No, nonsense. That's not how that works. Not how that works. They're striking for pay restoration and for the future of the NHS, to stop the brain drain and to increase recruitment. If the pay does not get fixed, neither of those things will get fixed. Labour, Tory, does not matter whatsoever. The BMA are not affiliated to the Labour Party. It doesn't matter as far as they're concerned. They need to get rid of private involvement. We already have West Streeting going to war with the BMA over private involvement, over the change of the GP's contracts. We saw Anna Warrington make this exact case on Politics Live beforehand, where she basically destroyed Joe Coburn on her incredibly biased view on the doctor strikes and on the NHS funding and the privatisation within the health service itself. Just because the red team are in charge does not mean that the strikes are just going to stop overnight. And anyone who believes that it is without extra money being on the table lives in Fantasyland.
Returning to growth, Keir Starmer says he has a strategic plan for growth. We don't quite know the details. Maybe he doesn't yet know what the details are.
Of course he doesn't know the details. He doesn't know how economics works. Literally, this guy knew nothing about economics until April 2020 when he was elected. He knew nothing. Again, or as far as I'm concerned, basically the only thing we know about him is going to be pressing the growth button. That's basically the only plan that he's got.
One of the problems, John, is that why should people here trust what Sir Keir Starmer says? When he ran for the leadership, he had a very different strategic plan for growth. It's all been dropped.
I think that all leaders, when they come in, they may have different things they promise in their leadership election, which then get filtered out by the time it gets to an election. With Rishi Sunak, he promised...
filtered out. Yeah, filtered out. That's what it was. It was filtered out. They weren't deliberate lies or anything. It's not like anyone has completely admitted that they were deliberate lies to hoodwink the membership. And in fact, we literally have it on record in this tweet that I read you before. McSweeney ran a campaign that focused ruthlessly on convincing Corbynites to abandon Corbynism without realising, and it worked. They know they lied. It was deliberate. And anyone who disagrees, again, it's just delusional.
All parties on all sides, you do see the finessing ideas and things change as they come along. But on the particular point of growth and how can you show that you're going to stick to your promises, it is really difficult. The Tories said they were going to build hundreds of thousands of homes every year, and actually, despite having an 80-seat majority, they found it very difficult to make those changes to plan.
Yeah, because the state needs to build the homes. We have Homes England. We have the access to the Bank of England. We have all the resources that we need to build loads of council homes now. And both parties are saying that they won't do it. They won't free up new state money for council homes. The root cause of all of this problem. And yeah, exactly, finessing ideas is literally doublespeak. It's not even doublespeak, it's just nonsense. It's trying to pretend they have a plan when they literally have nothing. They have nothing. And it's New Labour who've run out of ideas, trying to throw see what sticks, just kind of bollocking around with tiny little fringe things on the side without any actual change because they've run out of steam. It's zombie Blairism. It's zombie Blairism because it's not being done with purpose. It's being done because they haven't got a clue what else to do.
I mean, let's just take a couple of the things that have been scrapped by Keir Starmer, rightly or wrongly. Increasing tax on top earners, nationalising all of the utility companies. That was a strategic plan for growth or for the economy. It's all been dropped. Why should we trust what you and Keir Starmer say you're going to do now? You'll come up against pushback, you'll drop it.
What people want from leadership is people who adapt to the circumstances of the moment. We have had the mini budget that blew a hole in our economy. We've had COVID. We've had the cost of living crisis exacerbated by poor...
Again, how does does this low in the economy nix your plans? Tell me, explain to us and the general public why it is you can't engage in these things because of the hole in the economy. What is stopping you? What is the barrier to engaging in this? Is it indeed political will, or is there some kind of economic impossibility? Because I'll tell you what, the second is not true.
But that's what the government
choices.
says all the time.
Yeah, so we have to adapt. We're the opposition. We're not a protagonist in the way that our economy is being run at the moment, so we have to adapt. Keir Starmer has adapted, but now we are in the period where we are moving decisively towards a general election because the government can't delay it more than a year and a bit. So we are actually now giving policies and indications of the direction of travel, which will be firm going into it, depending on whether we have another mini budget, whether we have another 2 prime ministers between now and the next general election. Because we had 3 in one year, we might have 3 in the next. We thought we would inherit HS2 being on track because of the way it's been acted.
Then just say we want to continue with HS2. Say I want to continue with HS2. And then suddenly everyone who is thinking about buying all of the land that's trying to be sold off won't buy it because they know it'll just get CPO'd again by a Labour government in 6 months' time.
When we delivered HS1, it was done on time, on budget, at the same cost as France and Japan doing their high-speed networks. This one became 4 times more expensive and it's been scrapped and not delivered.
I mean, Kate, there will be a reassurance for some floating voters that not much will change necessarily if Labour wins next year. And maybe that is where they're occupying the ground that says, you can trust us, you can be reassured by us, we're not going to be too radical.
Yeah, I mean, clearly Keir wants to reassure voters that it's not going to be too radical. There's a thing about responding...
We need radicalism, though. Again, this is managed decline that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I do wonder what the difference between their policy kind of really is. The planning policy Rachel announcing today sounds very similar to what we heard from Liz, very similar to some of the stuff we hear from Rishi even. Paper between the two on that at the moment.
Right, I mean, what is going to be transformative, Peter? I mean, your only substantive proposed tax rises are scrapping the non-dom status and VAT on private schools, which would raise £3.2 billion a year and £1.7 billion a year respectively. Let's just put that next to a £1,000 billion of day-to-day spending currently by the government. You're talking about £5 billion in terms of what you propose to transform the country compared to £1,000 billion of day-to-day spending. They're the figures from the Institute for Fiscal Studies.
Well, so many of the issues and challenges in the NHS are interconnected because everything is front-loaded now. Money is being squandered on managing the backlog of treatments. So if we can tackle the backlog with our NHS staffing plan, which is being funded by the non-dom tax status, by increasing profoundly the number of diagnostic materials, which is funded by that tax, but also making sure that we can get an pay overtime, fully funded overtime, paid for by the non-dom tax status being scrapped.
So it was originally paying for the workforce expansion plan, but now it's paying for your NHS wish list. Just admit that it's fiscal expansion. How many things is the non-dom tax status going to pay for? Are we back in this world again, where every single part of the Labour wish list is all just going to be covered by this singular piece of taxation, which might not even work to be able to create this money in the first place? Just stop with the household budget rhetoric if you can't actually make the sums add up. It's pointless, and it moves the dial back 15 years back into the times of the financial crisis and there's no money left. No, but again, like they'll say we're going to spend this money on private sector involvement when that can't clear the backlog. You need to expand capacity. Ironically, the one policy that would actually help with the backlog is the thing that Boris Johnson promised, which was 40 new hospitals. It just, of course, was never actually going to happen because when the fuck were the Conservatives ever going to do capital investment? But at least he promised it. At least Boris Johnson went to the public and said, this is my plan, is to build new hospitals. Can you ever imagine in your wildest dreams Rachel Reeves standing up on stage and promising 40 new hospitals? Of course she wouldn't. That's not fiscally responsible. But it's also not fiscally responsible to have half your population out of work because they can't work because they're still waiting for an operation that should have been done 12 months ago because we've not got enough actual hardware, actual brick and mortar infrastructure available to expand the capacity to be able to bring the waiting lists down, which can't happen from the private sector because they use the same facilities.
But don't forget, when the Tories came in, they broke up all of the strategic bodies in the NHS. They scrapped all of the targets, but they didn't replace it with anything else that had grip.
They replaced it with the Lansley reforms that ruined it further. But then again, the internal market was stuff that was expanded by Blair anyway. So we still have Blair to blame for a bunch of this stuff. Of course, the Tories made it even worse, but...
We can end the waiting list challenge.
With more private sector involvement, which actually angers a lot of people here.
We will use whatever talent is out there in whatever bit of our country to tackle the priority.
It's the same talent. talent. It's literally the same talent. The private sector is working explicitly on the backs of NHS doctors doing extra work and overtime.
And make sure that patients get the treatment they need, because so many of them are living in pain. So many of them can't actually work properly in the workplace and earn the money that they need to. They're being held back. Our economy is being held back. Our country is being held back by this one issue. But this is all interconnected. So economic growth linked to the waiting list challenges. Other challenges in the NHS is being held back because everything is being dominated by the waiting list challenge. So we will use the money we can to end that challenge and then start working on all the strategic long-term challenges we face in the NHS as well.
I mean, one of the people I spoke to yesterday raised the issue about the health service, about her fears and concerns about more private sector involvement. It was started actually under Tony Blair.
It was started under John Major, but it was expanded by Tony Blair.
And now Peter is saying there's a real argument, as does Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, for actually turbo boosting that if it clears the backlog. How will that go down here?
I think it might not go down well with all quarters, but if you're someone who's been waiting months and months and months for a hip operation, you're unable...
Like China built hospitals in 2 weeks. China built hospital in 2 bloody weeks, right? Just build them. Just build things. Just can build shit. Just put the cement on the bricks, put them on top of each other. It sounds really hard, I know, but I believe that you can do it. I believe that with willpower and the strength of our country, of our great nation, we can indeed put bricks on top of each other
able to work.
With cement in between.
You're not really going to care what sort of hospital you get that operation in. And we have heard announcements from the Labour Party this week. The big announcement from Keir into Sunday was about how they were going to spend £1.5 billion on both increasing the amount of scanning equipment in hospitals, but also offering more overtime to doctors and nurses to clear the backlogs at evenings and weekends. But obviously, there's only so many workers in the NHS. We know that a lot of doctors and nurses already say they're overstretched. And so where else are you going to look for that capacity? You are going to have to look at things like private sector.
Let's welcome him.
No, you're not. Like, stop repeating this lie. It's the same infrastructure, it's the same doctors. There is no spare space in the private sector. That's just not true. The reason why people are moving from the NHS to the private sector is because of the waiting lists. All paying for private does is skip the queue. You get to pay to skip the queue because it's the same hospitals with the same staff.
Hilary Shand, hello to you. Is it a bold enough vision for you, or do you agree with Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of Unite, that she wants to hear something more radical from Labour?
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly want to see Labour going further with this. We want to see a commitments to real investment in this country. You know, we've got crumbling schools. We need investment in our hospitals, in our public services. What we would like to see, of course, is a commitment to nationalisation of our public services. And as we know, those policies tend to poll very well with the public. And at the end of the day, we've seen that the public are absolutely sick of the Tories. They are sick of austerity. And what we really need to see is a real investment in this country and a move away from what progressive think tanks are calling an investment phobia.
Well, I mean, when you say nationalisation, it's not going to happen. I know that there is a debate this afternoon, but the Labour Party...
And the thing is, right, okay, let's go to the nationalisation conversation. Let's think about the nationalisation conversation. The really important things to nationalise are rail, mail and water. Rail, super simple. All you have to do is wait for the franchise contracts to expire and then overtake them, and then use public investment on new rolling stock to upgrade it to European standards, and leave Allianz and KKR and all those private equity firms holding the bag with our old rolling stock. Mail is difficult. You have to actually pay money for mail to be able to bring that back. But we've all seen the negotiations between the CWU and the current leadership. This has to end. The posties are getting shafted because the desire for continual growth now the company has gone public is leading to contracts while they try and flog off Royal Mail to some private equity firm in Luxembourg. That has to stop, and the only way to stop it is nationalisation. With the water companies, they're literally dumping sewage and not fulfilling their mandate. You have the choice of unlimited fines. You can fine them with the share price portfolio. You could send people to prison at this point, quite frankly, given the shit that they've done. We know with the case of Northern Rock, in this case of gross incompetence and failure, then you can massively reduce the share price to be able to nationalise on the cheap. With energy, I think you don't need to nationalise the existing sector outside of the grid. I think you want to nationalise the grid. There's no reason that we pay a surcharge on the grid to be able to make sure that the national grid company that's now based in Canada can run operating profits. I don't think we need to pay that. But I think actually, now that we're outside of the European Union and we don't have to adhere to the European Union's competition laws. All we can do is use a state-owned enterprise to outcompete the energy market. Currently, because of Ofgem, the energy suppliers are fixed, they're capped at a 2% profit margin on the bills that you pay on energy. And there's no need to nationalise the big six when you can just compete them out of the market, given the power that the state has. And I think you can do the same by having state-owned renewable energy supplying the grid for cheap. Actually, I think that of all of the national infrastructure that needs nationalising, I think energy is my lowest priority, because really and truly it's changing the model and using the state to be able to compete is much easier than nationalising what we already have, especially given the current energy generation that we have. The lion's share of our current energy generation sector is mostly fossil fuels. It's mostly oil, it's mostly gas. So there's no real reason for us to spend loads of money buying out a bunch of obsolete energy generation. Why buy out oil and gas power plants when in 10, 15, 20 years they're going to be obsolete because we'll be trying to get for net zero? Just have a state-owned enterprise that builds loads of wind turbines, loads of solar, loads of tidal, loads of geothermal, loads of nuclear, and then use that to again outcompete and outlast, because the renewables are going to last longer. And again, you can just outcompete. You can just put Centrica and all of the big six suppliers out of business by competing with them, because we can do that now. Like, no Lisbon Treaty needs to be adhered to anymore. We can outcompete you all we want. Simple as that.
What do you say to Labour members who would like to see nationalising of, if not all the utilities, some of them?
Well, first of all, I would say I imagine that there's a lot more common ground than there is difference in what we would like to achieve in the Labour government. And the thing we agree on most of all is we need to win an election in the first place. Otherwise, we talk and we have these arguments and we don't deliver anything. When it comes to nationalisation, what we're going to do is be pragmatic about what will deliver the best outcomes for service users, but also best value for money for taxpayers. And
which would be nationalisation. Like, literally, especially when it comes to water. The best possible result for water is nationalisation. Trying to regulate it is going to miserably fail. How is regulation of the water industry going to work when it's failed all of this time up until this point? The investment into the new infrastructure in water is going to have to come from somewhere. If you just pay for it through bills, that's massively regressive. Everyone pays the same for their water bills. So as a percentage of people's income, poor people are going to be having a larger share of their own income paying for the upgrades to the water sector than rich people are. Which if we nationalise it and do it through taxation, it's mostly rich people paying it. Do wealth taxes, do capital gains taxes. Suddenly, you can upgrade the water sector, right? You can pay for the renovations, except poor people aren't going to see massive increases in their bills to do it. And the taxation is mostly going to come from the rich. So if you actually want to say what's best value for the taxpayer, it's clearly nationalisation in the case of water. And with the rail service, you don't have to pay anything because you can just wait for the franchise contracts to expire.
this is always the trade-off. Where we see that these things align, such as we have with the rail service, we found a way of cost-effectively bringing ownership of the rail network back into public hands, but doing so in a way that's linked to a better service for passengers. So these are the circumstances where we're very open to considering these things. What we won't do is just do it on ideological grounds when we think it would deliver bad.
Again, I will say it for the 1000th time. I keep saying, I will continue to say it. There is no such thing as being pragmatic and not ideological. What you perceive to be pragmatic will be informed by your ideology. Look at Royal Mail, because no one seems to be discussing Royal Mail. It seems all about energy and water and rail, but mail is a big one for me. As someone who was a member of the CW until very, very recently, since I quit my job in that sector, long-time member of the CWU. But in terms of the pragmatic grounds for nationalisation of Royal Mail, is that this is a service that has a 6-day mail guarantee across the country, nationwide. Doesn't matter whether you're in John O'Groats, whether you're in Land's End, it doesn't matter where you are, the Royal Mail has to deliver to you. And if you're running in the need of profit, this guarantee is at odds with your desire to make profit. So you'll cut corners, you'll give people worse service for other places around the country, and you'll do what's happening right now, and you'll turn yourself into a fly-by-night package courier rather than Royal Mail adhering to the duty as a public service, right? It's incompatible with the profit motive. That's why it needs to be nationalised. And this isn't about ideology, this is about pragmatism. Like, why would you force a private equity company to away its own money trying to hit the delivery mandate? Why would you do it? What's the point? It doesn't make any sense.
That's obviously extremely encouraging if that is something that, but it isn't something that we're consistently hearing from the leadership, I would say. And also, you know, what we have to be really cautious about here is this talk about sort of fiscal responsibility, that it isn't just fiscal conservatism by another name. You know, what we want to see...
Exactly. What we should have learned for the last 13 years of governance, right, is that fiscal conservatism is not responsible. It's not responsible to focus on the debt like it's some like absolute doom number. Mazzucato, she's spoken loads about how all the Reinhard Rogoff study, all bunkum. Stephanie Kelton talked about how deficits don't really matter. What really matters is labour and resources and where you're getting your growth from and continually growing out of the the debt to GDP ratio to keep that going down. That's what's really important. And look at the fiscal conservatism of the last 13 years as what's led to schools having collapsing roofs, schools and hospitals no less having collapsing roofs, because we've not bothered spending capital investment on concrete. Rishi Sunak went from 400 to 50 schools a year getting upgraded and retrofitted to be able to get rid of these kind of things. This is what happens when you put fiscal conservatism in charge of your country. Fiscal responsibility is spending money on the things you need to spend money on. And Rachel Reeves is repudiating the idea of spending that money in the first place.
Because people are sick of the broken Britain that we've got, and you cannot fix this broken country on the cheap.
Right, without more money. I mean, the £28 billion extra a year that's being pledged by a Labour government if it wins the election on green policies, that's already been diluted. It's already been delayed, certainly, by a year. That's the sort of thing that Hillary is worried about.
But once again, we've got to learn the lessons of Liz Truss's leadership and the mini budget. If you can't take the markets with you, then it will be completely unaffordable to do anything.
Okay, Peter, if you can't take the markets with you, I'm fine with that premise. You're absolutely right. We need to be careful of what happens to the valuation of our currency, of the gilt yields on any kind of future fiscal expansion that we engage in. I get it. Let's just assume that principle is correct. I believe it would be correct, but I understand people have different viewpoints on this. Please dictate to me, Peter. Please explain in very clear and short terms and briefly why you think new investment on infrastructure, which is positive for growth, positive for business, positive for the functioning of the economy, and I would argue entirely necessary for the function of the economy, why would that make the markets less trusting of a Labour administration? Why would it? Answer on a postcard. You can't answer that question because wrong. It's not true. The idea that tax cuts with no spending plans, with no OBR report, no fiscal treasury forecasts for how they're going to get the growth, where the spending cuts are going to come from alongside those tax cuts, what their Laffer curve projections are for those tax cuts creating growth to be able to fulfill that fiscal gap, right? How is that the same as saying we have this plan for this fiscal expansion, for this infrastructure, for this economic growth? Try and imply that these things are the same premise as political profligacy, because it's lies. It's literally a lie. It's total lies, and you are undermining the public trust in politics by drawing this gigantic false comparison, this false dichotomy, this false premise about what does or does not constitute fiscal responsibility.
Now, other countries, every other like-minded country, every other G7 country borrows to invest in critical infrastructure, to recapitalise your economy so it's facing the future and creating great jobs that are accessible to everyone. That's what we want to do. So we will get to that point where we are investing on that scale. But we have to be realistic that there are...
Yes, so the fiscal rules say that you have to wait until debt is falling as a percentage of GDP. And so you're assuming you're going to get economic growth first so that you can then justify that fiscal expansion. But what if you don't get the growth? No one's demonstrated where that growth is coming from. So you might be in a position, given that we're currently running a structural deficit, which is fine. I have no problem with structural deficits. But based on Rachel Reeves' own fiscal rules, if 2 years down the line, we've still not got a lower debt to GDP ratio than we have now, this borrowing, this new investment will never happen. It's like expecting a plant to grow and saying that you'll water it once it started growing. It's so dumb. It doesn't make any sense.
Lots of barriers to doing it from day one, but we will get there as a programme for government.
There's an incredibly simple solution to this. Tax the wealthiest in this country.
We will tax fairly, we will spend wisely. We are living in a world...
What's a fair taxation in which the majority of our taxation is being paid by people on PAYE and not people who have money and assets? How is that fair, Peter?
It's the highest tax rate for 80 years. The problem in our economy at the moment is growth. We have to make sure we invest wisely, get growth into the economy.
What about, even if you don't want to raise extra money for the exchequer, right? Even if you don't care about new money to spend on day-to-day spending through taxation to be able to increase tax receipts, even if you don't care about any of this, why not run on a platform of we will increase capital gains tax to reduce tax on earners, right? Why not say we'll meet capital gains tax where income tax currently is on both bands, on band 1 and band 2, right? On the basic rate and the higher rate, okay? And then we'll bring down the basic rate for income tax from 20% to 18% or something. Use capital gains tax to offset a tax cut on working people. Then you're not increasing the tax burden. The tax burden is the same. It's just burdened on different people. Would I increase both wealth and capital gains taxes? Yes, I would do both of those things. And I would want to do both, first of all, for extra money for the exchequer, second of all, to reduce asset prices. Actually, really and truly, the reason why you want a wealth tax isn't because you want extra money for the exchequer. That's what the Bank of England is for. That's how fiat money works within a country that has a sovereign currency. That's how that works, as a fiat works. You don't really need taxation unless it's kind of day-to-day spending, I guess. What you want a wealth tax for is to reduce asset prices, right? You want to reduce asset prices because 13 years of quantitative easing into the pockets of the financial sector has massively bloated asset prices, so that the real disparity in this country isn't really income, it's wealth. It's people who have loads of assets that continually appreciate versus working class people who have no assets. That's really the gap between working class people and the classes above them, is the level of asset wealth they have. And working class people have no assets because they've been boosted in value through all of this extra liquidity that's been pumped in through quantitative easing. That's what the wealth tax is for. Force the people with the wealth, with all the assets, to have to sell them to increase the supply, to drop the price, so that working class people have access to those assets again overall. That's what the wealth tax should be for. And capital gains should be used to offset income tax, to be able to control the money supply and to ensure that the people who do have the higher tax burden are not workers, the productive people that we're disincentivizing during a productivity crisis, when we could be disincentivizing people who make money being completely unproductive, which is what capital gains is. Making money off of just throwing assets around and buying and selling and then making money off of the profit, that's not work, that's not labour, that produces nothing. And we're incentivizing it by taxing it less, when we could be incentivizing working people being productive by taxing that less instead, and then increasing tax on capital gains. Would that be a deflationary effect? Technically, it would be a slightly inflationary effect, because people with assets who make money off capital gains are more likely to then spend that money on more assets to then make more capital gains, rather than on expenditure on commodities. Whereas if you have more money in the pockets of working people who spend most of their money on commodity spending, like actual retail goods, that could potentially be inflationary. But it's only inflationary if demand is already high and the economy is hot. If your economy isn't hot, which ours isn't, our inflation is from the increase in input prices, from the war in Ukraine, increased food input prices, Brexit, loads of different kind of myriad factors that increase the price of imports and the inputs into the economy. That's called cost push inflation. You can see that we don't have hot demand in the economy because people don't have extra money from higher wages. When you look at, say, for example, the amount to which people are taking money out of their savings accounts to be able to pay for the higher prices, you know that demand isn't the thing that's driving inflation. Supply prices are driving inflation, and then demand is meeting the new supply. That's why cutting taxes on working people wouldn't necessarily increase extra inflation, because all it would do is probably mean that people would be less likely to take money out of their savings. It's complex.
If Labour wins the election, before any of the sorts of things that you would like to see come to the fore?
Well, I think that issue will raise its head very quickly, because what you will find is that when you're on the doorstep, and Peter's been on the doorstep with me in Worthing, and what you will find on the doorstep is people are asking, why can't I afford to pay my energy?
Would it also motivate those with capital to spend it putting people to work? Yeah, because then you get much more value from your return investing it into a productive business, right? If you're making less money from capital gains, but if you keep the dividend tax where it is at the moment, then if you're somebody who's going to invest that money into a new productive business, you'll make more money off of the money you invest, because corporation tax would then be lower than capital gains tax. So you might as well become incorporated, become a corporation, create a productive business, invest in a productive economy. You'll make better returns from that than you would just throwing money at assets and waiting for them to appreciate.
Bills, and yet the energy companies are raking in billions in profits. And that is where the real dilemma is here. So we've got to try and change this rhetoric, and we've got to get back to what people are really talking about on the doorstep.
We're going to